Mollusca was given by Johnston. Phylum Mollusca includes soft-bodied invertebrate animals such as snails, slugs, mussels, clams, oysters, tusk shells, squids, octopods, and nautili, etc. Mollusca is the second largest phylum after Arthropoda. Study of mollusks is called malacology. Study of shells of mollusks is called conchology. Phylum Mollusca is divided into 7 classes. 1. Aplacophora. 2. Polyplacophora. 3. Monoplacophora. 4. Gastropoda. 5. Scaphopoda. 6. Palecypoda. And 7. Cephalopoda.
But the 3 major classes are Gastropoda, Palecypoda, and Cephalopoda.
First, you need to recognize that mollusks are part of the Bilateria. Specifically, they are bilaterian protostome animals in the Lophotrochozoa. If we look at our phylogeny, I've highlighted the Lophotrochozoans, and down at the very bottom are the mollusks. So on the lower right-hand side, I can show you here that mollusks are sister to the group that includes annelids, phoronids, brachiopods, and ribbon worms. We only really ever talk about mollusks and annelids in Biz 2C. The first thing to wrap your head around is that mollusks are an amazingly diverse group of animals. There's at least 90,000 described species that are extant, with both aquatic and terrestrial forms. There's a huge fossil record. In fact, the fossil record extends to about 70,000 additional species. And of course, they're commercially important to humans in things like food, but with some medical significance from poisoning, some venom, some parasite hosts as well. Last but not least, I can't stress enough that with all these species, they have great ecological and morphological diversity.
So some molluscan characteristics. So they range in size and body shape. The largest ones can be up to 1,000 pounds, 18 meters long, such as the giant squid, but 80% of them are actually less than 5 centimeters in length. Here's some other general characteristics. So they have 3 regions of their body, someplace called a head foot, they have a visceral mass, and they have a mantle. The mantle cavity is that main function for excretion, gas exchange, reproduction. That's a really important structure. They have bilateral symmetry and protostome development, but they are true coelomates. And they do all have an open circulatory system except cephalopods, those do not. And that blood is located in a tissue place called a sinus. They also have something called a radula, which is used for scraping food. The mollusk body, the 3 regions, so the head foot like we talked about, this is kind of the head and the foot combined as the name would suggest, so it helps with nervous structures and locomotion. That visceral mass, which you can see by looking at this diagram, is the space inside that contains all the organs, and then the mantle is usually the shell. Some other body parts, so the mantle, like we talked about, attaches to that visceral mass and encompasses most of the body. The mantle cavity is between the mantle and the foot. It's open to the outside. It has really important for gas exchange, excretion, and reproduction. And that radula that we talked about. So it's known as something called a toothed tongue, and it's a rasping structure that's found in the mouth, and it helps them with getting their food. So let's take a look at some of the classes. So gastropoda means stomach foot, and this is the largest and most varied class of mollusks. There's over 35,000 living species. Examples: snails, slugs, conch, limpets. They can live in marine, freshwater, or terrestrial habitats. Most of them do have shells, which is made of calcium carbonate. They also can do something called torsion. So this is 180 degrees twisting of the visceral mass, the mantle, and the mantle cavity. And this is how they actually bring their head into their shells. They also have something called an operculum, which is what closes the shell opening. If you've ever gone looking for seashells, you may have noticed that when you pick them up, you can tell the ones that are alive because there's like this covering at the opening. That's the operculum. And there's different types of shell coiling. So they can be whorl or apex. and we'll look at some of that in class. And there's a flattened foot for locomotion. So they have the shell, they can hide in their shell, but when they move, they come out. So they use cilia and muscular contractions to do this. And then they use that radula that we talked about for scraping. Maintenance functions, so their gas exchange is going to occur in the mantle cavity, and they have that open circulatory system we talked about. They also have a 3-chambered heart and a hydraulic skeleton, so they don't have bones, but they do have fluid that's in a pressure in the body that helps keep their shape. And some of them are dioecious and some are monoecious, so it just depends on the species in terms of their reproduction organs. So here's a sketch of the gastropoda. This is just a typical snail that
Snails move by contracting muscles in their foot. Snails have mucus on their foot that lets them move along sharp objects or upside down without getting hurt. That is why you can see the slime trail behind a snail. Snails have 2 pairs of retractable tentacles, one for the eyes and the other for sensing. Snails cannot hear. The largest land snail in the world is the giant African land snail. A snail eats using its tongue, the radula, that can have thousands of microscopic teeth on it. There are 2 types of snail shells, the apex pointing to the side or the back. My snail shells have the apex pointing to the side. The snail shells that have the apex pointing to the side have 2 types, the dextral, which is when it's pointing to the right, or sinistral coiling, when it's pointing to the left. A majority of snail shells have the dextral coiling. Snails need a good amount of calcium in their diet to have a strong shell. Most land snails are herbivores, but some are omnivores or carnivores. The wild helix garden snail lives for just 2 or 3 years. The Acatinidae snails can live 5 to 7 years in the wild. However, pet snails can live up to 15 years because they're safer from predators and parasites in captivity than in the wild. Most land snails are hermaphrodites, which means one snail can be both genders.
Snails are hermaphrodites, meaning that a snail is an organism that has reproductive organs normally associated with both male and female sexes. Snails live for around 2 to 5 years, and their sexual maturity age is variable between 6 weeks to 5 years, depending on the species of snail. The first stage of a snail's life cycle is the laying of the eggs. These eggs are produced after 2 snails undergo the mating process, which will be explained later. Both snails will produce around 100 eggs, but some species can have up to 400. These eggs are tiny, and they will be dropped into moist soil and covered. Land snails can lay eggs up to once a month. The second part of a snail's life cycle is the hatching of the eggs. The shell of the snail develops since it is an embryo inside its egg. Under favourable conditions, eggs hatch after approximately 2 weeks to 1 month, and snails emerge with a soft shell. Tiny snails hatch out of the egg with a small shell in place, and the shell grows spirally as the soft parts gradually increase in size. The third part of the snail's life cycle is the adult life. Shells continue to grow with the snail over the course of its life, and the rings it has are indicators of their age. In general, snails are victims of numerous predators, and therefore do not live very long in human terms. The final stage of a snail's life cycle is the sexual reproduction. The snail mating process involves sexual reproduction, and whilst both snails contain both female and male reproductive organs, they mate in the traditional way, as they do not fertilise themselves. Snails can last breeding from a couple of hours to almost half a day. Snails stab each other with a love duck, which which release hormones that will accept sperm to pass between the snails. During copulation, both individuals can transfer sperm to each other, but it does not happen during all cases. They can store sperm from previous couples for a long time, such as these males.